Hello everyone, how's it going? So this is the first or second video about Kotaku that I'll probably publish, we'll see, but regardless, Immortals of Avion proves it's a grim time for single-player games, as Sentence Studios' debut was a victim of overscoped budget and impossible expectations. Now, I did play this game, and I thought it was decent. Like, it was nothing truly that amazing, but it was a decent fantasy RPG. I think it had some really good lore and world building, but definitely it had major technical issues, especially on the PC. The semi-open world, I think, was definitely the wrong direction, because most of the optional objectives are just these timing puzzles that also are prone to technical issues and glitches, and don't really give you anything worthwhile other than gear that's subpar at best, and literally you get better gear as you just play through the single player. But in that regard, and it also had a lot of repeat enemy designs, so the final boss in particular, but I think it had some decent characterization. But yeah, it was a huge flop, there's no doubt about it. It didn't also help that it released in the same month of freaking Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon. I don't know who thought that would be a good idea. There was also Bomb Rush Cyberpunk, which is basically a spiritual successor to Jet Set Radio, which people have been hampering for. Sea of Stars, Blasphemous 2, so not exactly the brightest of ideas, but EA is kind of stupid when it comes to their release windows. They released Titanfall 2 and Battlefield in the same release window, which was just utterly stupid. I don't get their release window. And you can see that when it was launched that the studio let go 45% of their company because it just flopped very hard. Now, going down this article, in 2024, AAA games are often built around the idea of continuous revenue streams with microtransactions and live service elements. Yeah, it's hard to argue against that. Perhaps it's a corporate delusion that makes leadership think that a needless large budget makes a better game, but making adequate money back on a big budget blockbuster to satisfy the shareholders is becoming more difficult. Yeah, I agree with that. Immortals of Avion developer Ascendant Studio, whose staff include veterans from like EA, Sledgehammer, Telltale, made a debut with a magical-based single-player shooter last year, shortly after the team laid off half of its workforce due to poor sales. It sounds like the fallout had been given a team a more dire outlook of the AAA market. IGN ran a piece about the state of the video game industry after the unprecedented wave of layoffs had been going around in 2023. Isn't it 2023 or 2024? Because 2024 has been a massacre, a bloodbath. Yeah, 2024. So this is actually wrong, not 2023. The first 2 months of it says, okay. We've a month and a half in the year, and over 6,000 developers have been laid off across the industry. Among the developers who have weighed for IGN's story were some of the folks who worked on Immortals of Avion. They revealed that the game's budget was around $125 million between development costs and publisher EA's marketing and distribution expenses, but because the game undersold, it's impossible to recoup such high costs. At a high level, Immortals was massively overscoped for the studio's debut project, a former Ascendant studio told IGN. I actually 100% agree. Like, the game is extremely big, for a first studio game. Like, you would expect this from a company like Ubisoft as a first party title, but definitely not from a studio's first game. Like, I would have expected this game to be more of a single player linear experience, and I think that would have been far better than the semi-open world they decided to go for. The development cost around $85 million. I think EA kicked in $40 million for the marketing and distribution. Sure, there was some serious talent on the development team, but trying to make a AAA single-player shooter in today's market was truly an awful idea. What? Especially since it was a new IP that was also trying to leverage Unreal Engine 5. I would say this is more prudent. Shooter single-player games are still very popular. I know I'm going to use Call of Duty as an example, but Call of Duty is a good example. Shooter games are still in. It's just that it was a new IP and a lot of people looked at it and it just didn't really... People weren't interested. I saw a lot of people looking at the game and they were just like, this looks too much like information overload. Like, the common complaint I got from a lot of people was that they just couldn't really see what the hell was going on. And I agree with that, especially when I played the game on its hardest difficulty. There were so many flashing lights and everything going around that it's hard to keep track of what's going on. It also didn't help that a lot of the enemies, as I think I stated this, is on repeat. Like, you fight the same enemies over and over and over again, only with higher health pools, and they get more ads added to the fight. So they definitely dropped the ball on that. What ended up launching was a bloated, repetitive campaign that was far too long. Yeah, I agree with that. Like, if they made it a single-player linear game, like a Doom game, like they just put it into like a linear path, it would have been far better. But I guess they couldn't really have the upgrade system because that also was problematic. You can't play through the game once and get all the upgrades. You have to play through it multiple times. And even then, yeah, it's really grindy. On paper, single-player games like Immortals of Avium sound like an idea for those who aren't looking for a life-sucking live service game, but without better sales or in-game purchases to bring in money, it seems that single-player model is only sustainable on games with smaller budgets. I 100% disagree with that. Look at Octopath Traveler 2. Very popular, very positively rated game, but I think Square Enix said this didn't do as well, which is surprising. But Dead Space did very well. This was a very successful, very popular game. Very good if you want a sci-fi horror game, one of the best horror games you can play right now. Final Fantasy 16, yeah, this also undersold, but again, based on the popularity of the game. Marvel's Spider-Man sold 10 million copies. But you can make the argument that this is Spider-Man. You know, it's going to sell very well. But Baldur's Gate 3 sold around 27 million copies. And this is a brand new niche IP. I've been playing this recently. It's very good. Like, the story-wise, the game is very good. The gameplay, it's not my cup of tea. I'm not a fan of, like, the top-down tactical game. But I'm starting to go through it because I just want to know what happens next in the narrative. Like, the story is so good. So, I would disagree with this. Overscope is how Immortals of Avium ended up with a bloated, repetitive campaign, but swallows of video game industry apparently haven't figured it out yet. But this isn't about the video game industry, this is just about the developers. Like, they should have seen what was happening. There was a lot of just fluff within the game that didn't need to be there. For example, there's a part of the game where you have to go to a peace summit. It's an area where it's basically no one's allowed to fight here, it's just there to create negotiations. And you have to go through massive wave of enemies. You have to go through 2 to 3 areas, and the final area you go through is literally just a bunch of enemies that you have to fight so it can teach you a brand new mechanic. I'm not kidding you. On the way to the Peace Summit, you literally have to fight a horde of enemies right out the door. I'm like, why? Those realities are especially true for new unproven properties like this one. I think this person is trying to pad out their article because they're contradicting what they're stating. Like, I do agree with this. Like, new IPs have to take a very heavy lifting in order to succeed. Like, for example, Horizon Zero Dawn. When it first came out, it was not doing well. Granted, it came out at the same time as Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and then its sequel also came out on the same day, like the same window of Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild 2. And even though the game was good, I liked Horizon Zero Dawn and Forbidden West. A lot of the heavy lifting for that game came from the popularity of Guerrilla Games with Killzone, and not to mention Hideo Kojima himself gave the game approval. Like, he loved the game, and when you get approval from Hideo Kojima, the game is going to sell well. Eventually, it did sell well. Like, after Breath of the Wild kind of, went through its popularity period, a lot of people started playing Zero Dawn, and then they liked the game, so it kind of bounced back. But yeah, it's not a sequel or a remake. It doesn't take around 400 hours to beat. Yeah, but it does take 400 hours to max out your stats. It has 0 microtransactions, no pointless open world grinding. Oh, no, absolutely not. It has a lot of open world grinding. A lot. Especially if you want to 100% the game. It's all these stupid ass puzzles that you have to do. A current Ascendant developer told IGN. And although not everyone loved it, it was pretty well. Current sitting at a 74 on OpenCritic and mostly positive on Steam. No one bought it. It's a good game. Like, I would argue it's a good game, but the problem is that if your game doesn't have a good impression on its first release, it's just going to fall. It's like what happened with Days Gone. Like, when Days Gone came out, it was a huge failure. Granted, the game had many technical problems. I bought the game on day one, and a lot of people mirrored the issues I had with the game. The biggest being the technical issue with the sound. Like, the game was completely out of sync with the voice acting. And yeah, Days Gone didn't sell well, but then over time, once they released it on PC, it gained new life, and a lot of people loved it. They thought it was spectacular, and it's going to go unfinished because Bent Studio isn't going to make a new one because Sony canceled it. They said they're not doing it because they're trying to make their franchises into huge, like, monolithic IPs. And it also didn't help that the game was heavily compared to The Last of Us, despite the fact that two games are radically different in tone and atmosphere, not to mention the characters themselves. Also, people didn't like Deacon because they kept comparing him to Joel, and I was like, Deacon isn't Joel. Deacon is his own person, and Deacon is a pretty good character, but he's not a likable character. Whereas a lot of people like Joel because he protected Ellie. In Deacon's case, he had no one to piggyback off her. He did have his dead wife, Sarah, but in regard to the character itself, he was very unlikable. He sold people into slavery, he would kill people violently, he was just a generally very heinous person. Heck, you find out that he literally burned the tattoos off someone's back because they were kicked out of his gang. So he wasn't a likable person, but yeah. The sad thing is that it's alongside impossible to please executives who, even the best video games, are dealing with the problems of constantly increasing scope and therefore cost. Budgets are increasing for single-player games, but nothing else about the market has changed to compensate, outside from the developers frequently bolting microtransactions into the side of projects. Yeah, they're absolutely true about that. AAA development has skyrocketed, and they're trying to offset development by increasing the prices of games to $70. Not to mention, they're also isolating features that used to be core parts of the game, like, for example, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. Despite the game having hundreds of hours of content, you can't play it in New Game Plus unless you fork over $15. So now they're finding, like, creative ways to try and remove content within the game. They've been doing this for years, but they do it now more sadistically and basically waving it in your face. You can't 100% Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth without New Game Plus. There's literally an achievement there for that. Ideally, studios would scale back from huge open-world games, do anything and go anywhere games, desperately chasing ultra-detailed photorealism in favor of something that is sustainable, but the video game industry idea of sustainability is almost exclusively making a forever game that's constantly demanding people's money and time. I think the major issue is that the way that companies are run, because Nintendo has figured this out. Like, they sell their games, at a decent price. I mean, yeah, it's $70, but nevertheless, they make massive games as well. And they pay their executives and upper management well, and they still have a good employment record. So I think this is more of a Western issue, because it seems that Nintendo figured it out. So why can't Activision Blizzard and other EAs or Microsoft figure it out? The answer is they pay their executives so much money and they pay their developers next to nothing, and it leads to just burnout, calamity within the workforce, unrealistic expectations like with Call of Duty being on a 3-year cycle, and people hoping they would stop that, but Microsoft isn't going to let go of that cash cow because look how well Modern Warfare 3 sold, despite it being overpriced DLC. Even if Immortals of Aveum isn't a huge open-world game, its budgets still seem aspirant for something larger in scope that the game could reach. Perhaps not everything in the game needs to inspire to cutting-edge visual fidelity, and by saving money on graphics, it could hold back its budget while relying on multiplayer and live service elements. Shortly, more streamlined experiences made a profit much more easier 20 years later, but as budgets increase without feasible returns, the entire budget model is collapsing under the weight. Despite microtransactions and live service structures, dozens of games still die if they can't afford the foothold in players' everyday lives. Again, I disagree with this because we've seen games be massively successful. Baldur's Gate 3 is a massive game. Like, I'm not even past Act 1 and I already put in 25 hours into this game. It is a massive open world experience. Well, semi-open world, but it has so many layers to it. Again, Marvel's Spider-Man 2, 10 million copies. I don't have the numbers for Final Fantasy 6 or Octopath Traveler 2, but I'm sure these games sold well, but not well enough for Square Enix. But then Dead Space was also a massive success. This is a contained, semi-open experience that's a remake of an older game, and people love it. Yeah, it still has major technical issues. I don't know why, but, it's a spectacular game. It's a shame that a game like Immortals of Aveum can't get off the ground, not because there aren't things like it, but because no one up the top thinks that, what if the game doesn't have the biggest, most expensive version of itself? I disagree with that. Ultimately, the game isn't that great. Like, even though I liked the game, I gave it, I forgot what I reviewed it as, but I gave it like a 7 because I couldn't 100% the game because some of the puzzles were literally blocked off. They had major technical problems that prevented me from finishing them. Because I saw walkthroughs of the game and I'm like, why is my puzzle not operating like this? And I was like, okay, it's broken. And even when I played it on New Game Plus, some of the puzzles are still broken. So, yeah, it's also, yeah, the game isn't that great. People aren't a fan of this type of game because of the visual overload and all of that. Again, look at Baldur's Gate 3. This is a closed experience. This is a game that sold extremely well because people kept talking about it. People kept saying, you gotta play this game. This is amazing. It won multiple Game of the Year awards. It won so many allocates. People, like, on the surface, this game is just popular. Like, a person like me who hates top-down tactical games like this type of game, I'm even trying it and I'm enjoying it. So if you make a good game, people will buy it. People will say, oh, my friend told me about this game. Oh, I saw my favorite streamer playing this game. And in this case, it's just like Immortals of Avium just simply was not a game that a lot of people wanted. I would argue a lot more people wanted Armored Core 6, Bomb Rush Cyberpunk, Sea of Stars. And Armored Core 6 was also $60, just saying. And yeah, it also doesn't help that they got community noted on the Kotaku article saying that half of the best-selling games last year were single-player games. The article does not mention Baldur's Gate 3 has 500,000 positive reviews on Steam and won the VGA reward of this year. And I would also argue that even though I don't agree with the person's title here, they do have a lot of really right information, such as executives not knowing exactly what makes a really good game, having over-ballooned budgets and stuff like that. But I would also argue this doesn't really adhere to Immortals of Avium because at its core, it wasn't a game that a lot of people wanted or wanted to play. It just simply wasn't something that a lot of people were willing to invest into because games have become much more expensive. I'm not sure if this is a $70 game, but if it was, that would also be a major problem. In fact, let's look it up. Here it is. It's on sale right now, but was it $70? No, it was, the deluxe edition was $70, but still, like, if you had a choice between the game releases of this month, I'm pretty sure a lot more people would choose any other game than the new IP based on the reaction that it got. So I think the article is right. It's just the wrong fit for Immortals of Avium because at its core, this game would have been successful if it was a really good game. If people gave it like high reviews and lots of streamers were talking about it and enjoyed the game, it would have sold well. Like, just like with Baldur's Gate 3, just like with The Witcher 3, just like with Final Fantasy 7 Remake, a lot of people are excited for Rebirth. If it's a good game, people will buy it. But this just simply wasn't that great of a game. It's decent, but it's not something people are willing to invest money into. And when we look at the reviews, yeah, generally people did like the game, but a lot of people will argue the same point, that it's just boring in the way that they just deliver the combat system because it's a lot of repetitive grinding in order to get to the finale of the game. And let's just say the finale is very disappointed. Like, it's just not worth it, in my opinion. But, yeah, that's it from me. I know I said it's not worth it despite me saying I liked the game, but I was really disappointed with the finale of the game. I wish they kind of, like, maybe if they reduced the game to a linear game, they would have had more time to actually put in a good final boss. But tell me what you think in the comments below. I do disagree with the way this article was written, but I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below. Tell me what you think. If you want to support, like, sub, super thanks, join button, all that stuff. But that's it for me. Bye.